Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 advisory group. Rev 250 is a consortium now of about 70 organizations looking at ways to commemorate the American Revolution. And our guest today is Kylie Holbert, and Dr. Holbert is a scholar at Hampden-Sydney College. She received her PhD from the University of Georgia. She did her undergraduate work at the College of William and Mary. And she has just written a great book, The Untold War at Sea, America's Revolutionary Privateers. Welcome, Kylie. Welcome, Dr. Holbert.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. So this is actually one of the first books about the privateers. And so can you tell us first, who were the privateers? What did they do?
Sure. Revolutionary privateers came from a wide array of colonists in the 1770s. Carpenters, coopers, sailors who decided to sign up. But then you also have people of the middle and upper class who are investing in privateers, who are outfitting privateers. So it really was an operation that pulled from all avenues and aspects of society. And it was a longstanding tradition. Privateers operated in Anglo-American conflicts throughout the 18th century. Queen Anne's War, King George's War, War of Jenkins' Ear. They were operating prior to the Revolution, and then obviously when the Revolution broke out, it seemed like a no-brainer, you could say, for merchants to convert their vessels that were sitting in port to privateering operations.
So how would they do that? How would you convert a merchant vessel into a privateer?
A great question. It depended on what type of vessel you had, what your resources were. But oftentimes they would expand the cargo hold. Oftentimes they would add more weaponry, right? In terms of cannon, they would make their portholes larger so that they could carry more cannon. There are some vessels that I found that would actually put the copper sheathing right on their hulls to try to protect from sea worms and barnacles and other aspects of sea life, marine life, that might take a bite, literally, out of your ship. But there were also merchant vessels that didn't do very much in terms of converting, right? They just thought, well, hey, I've got a ship in port. I'm going to add a few guns to it and add a few sailors, and we're going to take our chances on the seas of the Atlantic and the Caribbean and hope for a profitable prize.
So what was it they were doing? I mean, they're going out looking for what?
Enemy ships. So privateers are different from pirates. Oftentimes I get this question, right? Like, oh, well, privateers were just legalized pirates. Not true, or I argue not true. So pirates had to have commissions, either from the Continental Congress or from colonial or state governments. And so the commission gave the privateering vessel the legal authority, in a sense, to cruise against enemy vessels. And the commission in the revolutions would specifically state which enemy vessels were allowed. So, because initially it was, just those of Great Britain, and then it kind of expanded to some of the other British Isles in the Caribbean. And so privateers
were these war vessels, or were they merchant vessels they're looking for?
Either one. Now, most privateers are going to go after the merchant vessels because merchant vessels are not as heavily armed as the British Navy. And privateers are looking for a profit. So they want to capture a merchant vessel that has a large cargo hold, that has something that's worth bringing into port to sell. There are cases where they go after British naval ships, but oftentimes if they find out it's a naval ship, they turn and go in the opposite direction, right? Because they know that they're probably outgunned, and also they're not going to get much from taking a British naval ship. But privateers did have to, different from pirates, privateers, as part of their commission, had to bring their prize into port and had to take it to a court of admiralty. So they had to legally have their prize proclaimed as a legal capture. And there are times when their prize was brought into court and the court said, nope, sorry, it's not a legal capture. It belongs to, an American citizen or a colonist, or it belongs to a neutral nation, right? Like the French or the Dutch or even the Swedish. And so they say, you can't keep the ship, right? It has to go back to its original owners. And so that process could be almost as challenging as the process of capturing the vessel in the first place.
Right. So what happens then let's suppose the court says, yes, this is a lawful prize, then what happens?
It goes to auction. So part of it, the court will say, all right, you have to put out a declaration in the newspaper, an advertisement that says to be sold at public auction at a public venue at this time in this place, and you describe the ship and you describe its contents, and then it goes to auction. Now, that's not to say that every part of the ship was necessarily sold, right? Sometimes outfitters would say, well, hey, let's literally re-outfit the ship as a privateer and send it out. But again, part of this is that those sailors or men who signed on to serve on privateers are looking for their share. So when they did sign on, they would sign articles of agreement. And these articles laid out what their job was on the vessel, but also what their share was going to be of whatever prize that they took. So oftentimes these sailors want to see a speedy conclusion to the case because they're waiting on their prize money. I mean, that's why they signed up in the first place. The promise of profit, the promise of payout for privateers is much higher than what the Continental Navy, for example, is paying their sailors.
Right. And what happens to the crew of the ship that was captured?
So it depends. There are some that are taken prisoners, depending if the privateer vessel that takes them has a large enough hold to hold all their sailors. There are times when they're placed on another ship and sent back home, right? Sent elsewhere. This is actually something that John Paul Jones, who is a commander in the Continental Navy, takes issue with in terms of privateers. He gets very upset with them for not taking enough prisoners. He says they're too lenient. They send them off. They don't bring them into port, basically because privateers don't want to have to feed them and don't want to have to worry about coming back into port. And so he says, this is terrible. This is an opportunity for us to take more prisoners and then have prisoners for prisoner exchange, and privateers aren't taking that opportunity to do this. He also has lots of other issues with privateers being a member of the Continental Navy. He feels like privateers also take manpower, which is a big issue for privateers, especially as the war goes on. Isaac Hopkins, John Paul Jones, even George Washington talk about how privateers are kind of rascals. You can't always trust them. They do what's best for them in a sense, right? They are self-motivated and they are oftentimes motivated by profit. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with these guys. I really like them, but I have to say they are motivated by profit. And that's not to say that there aren't men motivated by patriotism. I think that you certainly have men who are motivated by both, right? A mixture, but profit absolutely plays a role.
Well, that's, I think, a central tension in the quest for freedom or independence is, yes, it is patriotism, but also you want to get something.
Right, absolutely. They're not the only, I would say they're not the only combatants who are looking to gain something from the war. So I feel like that's part of it too, is that they get this bad rap, especially because in the post-war period, American colonists are looking toward establishing a legitimate nation. And in the eyes of the British, privateers are considered pirates because the British don't recognize the legitimacy of the Continental Congress. Right. So they're not going to recognize the legitimacy of commissions granted by the Continental Congress because they don't recognize the body in the first place. So the British do call American privateers pirates, and they bring them, when they capture them, they take them to prison ships. They also take them back to like Mill Prison, for example, in England. And they are very reluctant to exchange privateers because they don't view them as the same caliber, you could say, as or level maybe as other American combatants during the war.
Well, they don't have a great record about exchanging other combatants, as you mentioned.
That's true.
Either.
Yes. And there's been some really great recent scholarship about that as well, about how the exchange of prisoners is also kind of a political, right, battle going on as well. But it's interesting that sailors at least had the hope, maybe you could say continental sailors, right, had the hope that maybe there would be some prisoner exchange, whereas privateers really didn't even have that.
Well, so are any charged with piracy and then hanged?
So that is a great question, and not that I found, and I wonder if that's because the British thought that would be taking it almost a step too far, right? But they certainly were willing to treat them terribly. There are some journals that describe conditions like they're eating grass, but obviously that's other American combatants who are taken prisoner are also describing similar conditions. So those conditions are the same across the board for privateers as well.
Right.
But they're held throughout the Atlantic. They're held in the Caribbean when they're taken in the Caribbean, and obviously then in England, and then in the prison ships off the coast of the colonies.
Great. We're talking with Kylie Holbert, the author of The Untold War at Sea, America's Revolutionary Privateers, a great new book which looks at this really, many ways, untold story. And you've mentioned this kind of tension between the Navy and the privateers, but you also make the point that the privateers were at sea first before there was a Continental Navy.
Yes, and they're much larger than the Continental Navy ever is. And that's not to knock the Continental Navy necessarily. Obviously, the Continental Navy had its own issues getting outfitted and getting out to sea. I mean, poor John Adams, I think, was having a fit in the Continental Congress trying to convince people that it was worthwhile. But yes, privateers, because they are privately owned and operated for the most part, because they don't need government funding and because they only need the commission really to get out of port, they can be outfitted much more quickly. And as we were discussing, because they offer a greater chance of return for those who sign up, they are also able to man their vessels more quickly. And so you see merchants whose trade has been interrupted because of war, because of the British Navy, who say, well, all right, rather than letting my ship, kind of rot in port in a sense, I'm going to get it outfitted. I'm going to get it out there. So, I mean, before even the Declaration of Independence is signed, sealed, and delivered, we have privateers that are operating in the Atlantic. So they are some of the first alongside, right, Minutemen and the militia who begin to take the war to the British.
And where do they come from, mainly?
The majority are from New England, but that's not to say that there aren't privateers from Virginia and South Carolina. Most of them, need a place to bring prizes back into port. So like the main port towns like Charleston, right, New York, up then obviously in the Boston area, there are a number of harbors where privateers sail from. And estimates are maybe upwards of 50,000 or more served on privateers. This is the frustrating part, or maybe the exciting part about studying privateers, and the fact that this is something that hasn't been studied extensively, is that we're still figuring out numbers and we're still trying to compile. So part of the problem is that a ship might set sail as the Revenge on a cruise in, March of 1777. And then it comes back into port. It has a prize. It's done really well, but the outfitters decide to kind of switch it up a bit. So, two guys leave and another investor comes in, and the new investor says, I don't want it to be called the Revenge. I want it to be called, the John Adams. And they send it out as the John Adams. Well, it's the same ship, but it has a new commission and it's a new cruise. So then it's a question of, well, when people ask me, well, how many vessels were outfitted? It's like, well, are we talking about like vessels as in literally the physical entity of a vessel, or are we talking about vessels in terms of how many commissions are granted or how many cruises they take? So, I mean, estimates are anywhere from, 1,200 to over 2,000 vessels that might have sailed. And then the question then becomes, well, how many prizes did they bring in? And that becomes is also a tricky question. Right. Again, an exciting question, but a tricky question, because there are prizes that are captured by an American privateer that are then recaptured by a British privateer or by the British Navy. There are prizes that are brought into port, into that court system that we were talking about, that are then found not to be an actual prize, and they are returned to the original owner. So then the question, it's like, well, there are at least we think, right, based on like Lloyd's list and everything, like at least 600 British vessels that are taken during the Revolution. It could be more than that, though. And then the next question is, oh, well, how much is a prize? How much do you get out of it?
Yeah.
And that is tricky too. I mean, on average, based on some of the numbers that we do have, prizes could be about 45,000, could bring in about $46,000. But again, that can vary widely depending on what the cargo was, depending on the shape of the cargo, depending on the market that you bring the cargo to, right? It's based on supply and demand, who's willing to buy it, how much are they willing to pay for it. So it is a very complicated system, a very interesting system, and one that I'm hoping certainly deserves more exploration, right? That this is just the tip of the iceberg in a sense. And that, I mean, even the court system, I talk about the court system, and I spend a chapter on that. And the court system is really interesting. The legal intricacies, the kind of web that gets spun around privateers, they are one of the only combatants who have to publicly and legally make the case for their prize money, right? For the money that they're going to be paid, which puts them in an interesting predicament and an interesting situation, because they're trying to prove that the prize that they took, right, is legal, does not belong to an American citizen. I mean, there are examples from the Court of Appeals where a prize is brought into port, and the owner comes in and says, well, I wasn't carrying British cargo. I'm not a British citizen. I'm an American citizen. My cargo is American. This isn't legal prize. And then you also have examples where a prize is brought in and the owners try to argue, well, no, we're from a neutral nation, right? We're from the Dutch Republic, or we're from, we're from France, or where have you. And the matters become complicated because when vessels are taken prize, oftentimes the captain throws papers overboard because they don't want their important papers to be taken by whomever's taking them. And then the American privateers say, well, you don't have papers, and you don't have papers because you're British, and you didn't want us to see that you were either of British ownership or that you were carrying British supplies. And to me, it's fascinating because it does become this very convoluted system for privateers.
It really does. And we're talking with Kylie Holbert, the author of The Untold War at Sea, America's Revolutionary Privateers. You mentioned the Court of Appeals. So who is that?
Oh, that's a great question. So the way that the Court of Admiralty is set up, it takes a long time. It takes almost the entire war to have these courts set up. And every state is slightly different. There are some states that allow appeals to the Continental Congress. And then there are some states that do not allow appeals at all. And then there are some states who say, well, you can only appeal if the vessels involved are from different states. So, but the Court of Appeals is ultimately, after much bickering, you could say, and negotiating and deliberating, the Continental Congress ultimately does create a Court of Appeals. And what they do is they have a group of delegates they appoint judges. They end up appointing judges to serve on the Court of Appeals. And that court hears any cases that are brought to the Continental Congress from the states. So there's a great source, the Revolutionary Prize cases of the Court of Appeals contain 109 cases that were brought to the Court of Appeals. Now, I think there are 4 or 5. Not all of them have paperwork involved with them. There are actually a few cases that literally just have the names of the parties involved, and that's it. Which obviously to me is extremely frustrating because what happened? Why are they here? And there's like no paperwork. But then there are some that have 50 or 70 pages of paperwork, which includes depositions and evidence brought, like paperwork that was perhaps taken by a prize. And so whoever is the clerk in the original court compiles this packet basically and forwards it to the Continental Congress's Court of Appeals. And then the Court of Appeals deliberates and then makes a decision. Unfortunately, oftentimes in this particular source record, it'll just say Court of Appeals reviewed the case and decreed, affirmed the below court's decision. Or it'll say, or the Court of Appeals overturned the lower court's decision and X, Y, and Z should happen. But there's not much in terms of why they do that. And that's, for me, that's kind of my next big question. I don't know, maybe is, why does the Court of Appeals make these decisions? How often do they overturn? How often do they keep it? Is there a pattern going on there? But for privateers, again, it makes the system that much more complicated because you have to bring your prize into port. You have to bring it to the court. If that initial court does not rule in your favor, you do have the option to appeal to the Continental Congress or to the Standing Committee on the Court of Appeals. But once that court makes its decision, that's it. So if you're a privateer who basically is ruled against once or twice, if you're ruled against at the Continental Congress level, that's it. And you're done. And then all that investment, all that effort that your crew has put into it, all that money that the investors and the outfitters have put into it is you have no return on that. So it really is a risk reward situation for privateers.
It really is. And we all, many of us know about John Paul Jones and and you said you spent a lot of time with these guys, you like them. Are there characters like Jones who stand out to you
there are. So there are a couple that I highlight in the book. George Waite Babcock is one who's on several. Gustavus Cunningham, who there are some who argue that he is a Continental naval commander. I actually argue that based on his commission and his actions, he's a privateer. He's actually one of those. He has an international crew. Ben Franklin signs a privateering commission for him in France. He ends up taking a Swedish brig at one point, the Honoria Sophia, which causes like a huge international incident. France is upset. Obviously, Sweden's upset, but then England is upset because France allows him to bring his prizes into port. And so it's just one of those things where, again, there's so many moving parts. And so Cunningham is one of my favorite. It's interesting, after the war, he actually goes to the Congress and asks them for a pension because he says, I was a Continental naval officer. And they say, no, you weren't. And to me, that's the biggest thing, right? Franklin calls him a privateer. Silas Deane calls him a privateer. And then the Congress says, you were not a commissioned officer. And he dies without a pension, without any of that recognition. So now, granted, there are obviously others who are denied pensions because the Continental Congress doesn't have, or the Congress, now we're at the Congress at that point, but the Articles of Congress doesn't have a lot of money to begin with. So there are other factors at play there. But privateers are bringing in, the international factor of the American Revolution as well. France, Spain, waters in the Caribbean, sailing around Ireland, just trying to figure out how do we win this war, right? How do we
Right.
make it so that the British are suffering enough that they don't want to
Mhm.
continue fighting us?
Right. Right. Would they have to bring their prizes to American courts, or could they bring them to French
No,
or other allied courts?
they could bring them to France and Spain. So it's interesting. France allowed privateers to operate out of its ports prior to the treaties in early 1778 that were signed in February 1778. But again, it was tricky. Privateers had to be careful about who they were taking, where they were sailing, was it legal prize? Depending on where a privateer took a prize, often depended on what port they sent it to, because they
Mhm.
wanted to send it to the nearest port to get it off the waters
Right.
so that it wasn't then retaken by somebody else.
Mhm.
So that obviously played a role. But yes, French ports and Spanish ports were open to privateers. Eventually, after Cunningham's incident, actually, the French say, we haven't officially entered the war here. We're getting a lot of heat and pressure from England. We don't want, right, this unwanted attention in a sense. So you need to go elsewhere, right? Like the British don't like you, Cunningham, you need to go elsewhere. And then he starts operating out of Spanish ports. There are British sailors who write home and say, this is ridiculous, basically. We're sitting here and we're waiting to get into the Spanish port. And Cunningham comes sailing in and they salvo him and they shoot off a cannon and he shoots off a cannon in return. And they're like welcoming him in with open arms. And we're sitting here getting butt kissed, basically.
Yeah.
So then it just adds to that international factor where obviously the British are like, we know something's going on. We know you're giving the Americans, you're showing favoritism here. And yet the letters, are flying back and forth between administrators saying, oh, no, we didn't mean to show offense. I'm so terribly sorry. This was a mistake. The port commander shouldn't have done that. I don't know why he did that. And then, but really, exactly why he did that. So, I mean, that part of it too is just great. Because again, privateers are kind of like thumbing their noses at the British and saying, we see you, kind of thing.
Wow. Where was Cunningham from?
He's from Philadelphia. He's actually Irish, and his family immigrates over, and he operates out of Philadelphia.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're talking with Kylie Holbert, the author of The Untold War at Sea, America's Revolutionary Privateers. And of course, another area the privateers were valuable in was actually taking supplies that the Continental Army desperately needed.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that's the other thing too, is that when they do bring their cargo in, right, there are supplies that can be then distributed to continental forces. Now, this also sometimes becomes a point of contention between the Continental Congress and members of the Continental Navy, like John Paul Jones, and privateers, because there are those who feel like privateers should come in and should basically earmark certain things for the forces, right? Should basically say, oh, well, we captured this, we're giving this to forces. But again, the owners and outfitters and privateersmen say, well, no, we invested in this. The Continental Congress didn't invest in this, and we want to see a return on that. So then that also becomes a basically place where public opinion oftentimes falls against privateers, because they're seen as profiteers. That's not to say that valuable supplies don't end up going to the continental forces. They certainly do, but for some, it's not as linear of a route as it should be, right? It's not as direct of a route as it should be when those supplies are captured. But that's the thing. I mean, the Continental Congress commissions privateers, but they are not footing the bill, right? They're not putting money into I mean, there are some vessels that the Continental Congress does outfit. But then obviously they're also focusing on the Continental Navy. Most of the vessels are privately owned. And so they don't owe, it's not like the commission says, well, you owe, a third of whatever you get to the Continental Congress when you come back. There is no agreement in terms of that. Obviously privateers did have to put up a bond when they signed commissions, and it depended on the state as to how much that that bond was. And there are instructions, specific instructions that are printed and given to privateer captains that say, you have to act this way. You have to treat prisoners this way. Again, this is why John Paul Jones gets upset about the prisoners, because it's like, you're supposed to take prisoners and you're supposed to treat them this way and bring them in. And, and then there are instructions or kind of regulations in the Articles of Agreement that captains make with their privateersmen that say, you are signing on to this privateer vessel. Here are the rules and regulations that you will follow. But again, that's not the same. Those rules and regulations aren't the same necessarily on every ship. And once you're in the middle of an ocean, rules and regulations sometimes go out the port window. Like they're left behind, because in the heat of the moment you see a ship and you want to take that ship, and by golly, you're going to go after it.
What was this bond for that they had to put up?
Basically, it is for if there is misbehavior or if there are issues. So there are instances, for example, of neutral vessels. Like there was a French vessel that was taken by privateers that the French ambassador wrote to members of the Continental Congress and said, what is going on here? Like, why are your privateers taking our vessels, right? And so the Continental Congress did want to have some power, like in terms of revoking the commission. They could tell them, you have to bring this back to port. You again, through the court system, this is not a legal prize. You have to return it. So there are some strings that the Continental Congress can pull to try to maintain control, but at the same time, again, once a vessel leaves port, until that vessel comes back, you're in limbo in a sense. And I mean, Benjamin Franklin is trying to deal with that. Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, who are in France, commissioners to France, are over there, and oftentimes are like putting out fires, here and there, trying to say, I'm that. They didn't mean to do that, or we are so deeply sorry. Our instructions specifically state that a privateer is not allowed to do that. They were not operating, and we will reprimand them. Like, we will take care of this. But again, how much can you do? I mean, you can take their commission, and then 6 months later they find another vessel with another outfitter under another name, and they're back out there. So
wow. Great stories. And we've been talking with Kylie Holbert, the author of The Untold War at Sea, America's Revolutionary Privateers, which has a lot of wonderful stories as well as this great context. So we understand the importance of these privateers. And so thank you for joining us, Kylie. We'll have to have you back soon, because you have another thing you've done about movies about the Revolution. And a big question we all have is, why aren't there any good movies about the Revolution? And
great question.
Well, we'll talk more about that next time. And so anything else we should mention before we close?
No, I mean, yay, book. No, I'm very excited about it. And thank you guys so much for having me. I clearly, as you can tell, I love talking about privateers. I love talking about the Revolution. So this was a real treat. Thank you so much.
It's a great story. Well, it's a great treat for us to have you. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, as well as our listeners around the world. We initially thought, Kylie, we'd have a group of people here in Massachusetts, but actually we have an audience in all around the world as well as all around the country. So I want to thank particularly today our friends in Peekskill, New York, Southampton in England, probably a place that saw one or two privateers during the war. Wake Forest and Richmond, places closer to your home. And thank you all for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.